How do I learn Azure in 2023? Where would I even start? As we start into 2023, if you're a developer, you should have at least a solid understanding of what is available in Azure for you and how to use it. In this video, I'll start out by discussing why Azure is important to know well. Next, we'll go over the order to learn Azure in and the steps to take to learn each part well. After that, I will cover the easy path to learning Azure and some tips to effectively learn and utilize Azure. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey. I've been a software developer for over 2 decades. I'm a self-taught developer who struggled through all the dead ends, missteps, and conflicting information in my journey to really understanding how to become a great software developer. Now I spend my time making it easier for others. This video is just one of many resources I have to offer. Here on YouTube, I have almost 500 videos around C#, Azure, SQL, and a bunch of other topics that are related, as well as 3 full courses. I also have other free resources, as well as my paid courses on IamTimCorey.com. If you want to be prepared for the real world as a software developer, I can help. Now, I do want to point out in this video, we're going to focus in on web development, C# development, .NET development, those type of things when learning Azure. That's important because Azure has a bunch of services, dozens, hundreds of services that cover a lot of different things. And so we're going to focus in on what does a developer need to know. Now, if you're in a different part, if you're into networking or if you're into something else, other things might apply. But it's really focused in on developers and how to best utilize Azure. All right. So let's start off with why Azure. Why is it important to understand Azure? Why is it important to know Azure? And why do we even care? Well, first of all, it works great with .NET or C# and other Microsoft products. So if you're a C# developer, if you're an F# developer, if you're a VB developer, if you work with Microsoft SQL, if you work with other Microsoft products, Azure works great with these and it has first-party integration. Now, other cloud services do support .NET, C# and others. It's just that that's more of a necessity on their part, not necessarily their primary driver. Where the Azure, it's their primary driver. They support their own things. Now, Azure also supports other systems like PHP and Python and Java and so on. So it's not just their primary support, but they support other things as well. But we're focused in on, hey, if you're working in the Microsoft space, this integrates really well. Number 2, Azure is safer for beginners. This is borne out through experience, borne out through a number of conversations I've had with newer developers or people learning the different cloud platforms. And one of the things I hear quite frequently is, oh my goodness, I created this demo, I followed along the tutorial, and then I found out in the next month that I had a $10,000 bill. And that's scary. And it makes you not want to work with the cloud. Because if you can randomly get a bill and you don't know if it's coming or not, and you think that you deleted all your testing stuff, but you find out you didn't delete everything, just most things, that's scary. And it makes you a lot less likely to try it out. So with Azure, there are a lot of safeguards in place that allow you to protect yourself from errant billing, from billing that you don't expect, you don't realize, or that you don't plan for. Now, you can absolutely still generate a $10,000 bill accidentally, but it's safer, not safe. You cannot just randomly do stuff and not expect to have consequences. It's just there's a lot more safety features seemingly in place. It's a lot more clear how to safely not get billed. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, it's somewhat less confusing. I say somewhat because there is no cloud platform that is not confusing. And the worst part is it feels like the naming conventions are horrible in every cloud platform. In Azure, they're at least a little better. For example, what do you think an Azure web app is? Well, it's probably a web application, and you're right. And what is an Azure SQL database? Well, it's a Microsoft SQL database in Azure. You're right. Now, there are other things that aren't quite as clear. What's Cosmos DB? Well, it's Microsoft's answer to or response to MongoDB. They created Cosmos DB, which is similar. It's a document database. So, yeah, that's a little unclear. It's also unclear sometimes when there's multiple services that can do the same thing. Azure Web App, Azure Static Web App. Which one do you use? So there are some times when there are multiple services that do similar things that do make it confusing. So I'm not saying that Azure is not confusing, but it's somewhat less confusing. The naming scheme is a little better. There are some things that help with the clarity and some definite benefits there. Number 4, when you do it right, Azure can be very inexpensive. Now, again, if you do it wrong, it can be very expensive. But I hear people a lot of times say, well, it's so much cheaper to do it on my own. That's not usually true. One of the biggest benefits of the cloud is the economy of scale. The fact that when you are doing 10,000 databases, it's cheaper per database than if you're doing one database. And those reductions in cost get passed along. However, there is other things that are done that maybe you're not doing. For instance, let's talk about databases. The databases are automatically backed up in Azure. And there are systems to create better backups and different backups and control those. But by default, there's some backups in place. And configuring that can be as simple as a couple of clicks of a button. And there are other things in place, like there is redundant internet providers. There is biometric security on the physical locations. And there is Halon fire suppression systems. And there's UPS battery backups and multiple power sources and multiple different places in the same region and so many other things. Well, those are things you're probably not doing. You probably have a server on a UPS. You probably have one internet provider and you also share that with your company. And you probably don't have great security. Maybe it's a lock and key. So when you go to Azure, you increase all those things. So yes, there can be some increase in costs there, but by and large, Azure is inexpensive when done right. So I worked with a company where we took their products from just a server over to Azure, and we ended up increasing the scalability, increasing the availability, increasing the global reach, and the speed at which customers could get access to our sites while reducing costs. If you do it right, it can be cheaper. It's not going to be super cheap necessarily unless you're very small. Okay, number 5, almost infinitely scalable. This is a great feature of any cloud provider, but Azure is no different. It's almost infinitely scalable. If you decide that you want to have your website replicated around the globe with multiple locations where your user can go to the closest location possible to get the fastest possible response time, you can do that very simply. In fact, my IamTimCorey.com website is an Azure static web app, which means it's replicated around the globe. I pay $9 a month because I'm paying for extra stuff. And yet it's replicated around the globe. It's super fast and it's done for me. So almost infinitely scalable and really easily so as well. If you've ever worked with database scaling and trying to do things like replicating databases, it can be super hard. With the cloud, super easy. It's much, much easier to just say, hey, I want to have 2 of these. Hey, as a website, I want you to, when we have a load problem, I want you to just spin up new servers. And it will do so just in time. All right, number 6, it's quick to get going. This is something that when I was working as an IT director, one of my roles was to oversee the server room and setting up on site our database, our Exchange server, our Active Directory, and so on. To get a SQL Server installed and configured and set up right can take hours, because you have to do things like make sure you have the separate drives and format them correctly, and make sure you have redundant connections to the network, and configure the server right, do the updates on the server, then install SQL Server, then do the updates on it, then configure all the right settings and know what things to do. With Azure, you say, here's the name of my database, and here's the size I want it to be, and here's how much I want to pay for it. And it's done. It's done within 30 seconds to a minute, usually. So very quick to get things up and running correctly. So you can get a SQL Server up and running really quickly if you don't worry about any of the configuration. If you leave all the defaults the way they are and just hope things are right. But if you set it up in the cloud, by and large, it's set up right the first time with the defaults, or it will ask you, what should these settings be? Because these are the ones you need to configure. So quick to get up and going. And there's lots of free or testing options. Like I said, my production website, I paid $9 a month for because I want to have some additional features. I could pay nothing for it. A SQL Server, a Microsoft SQL Server, which can cost thousands of dollars to install locally, can be as little as $5 a month. You can set up a lot of things for free. When I go through this in my course, we do a bunch of stuff. And the entire course, everything we do, I show you how to do it for free. All the testing, all the configuration, all the trials, 10 free websites, a free Cosmos DB, and so many other things. Azure Functions up to 1 million calls a month for free. There's lots of stuff you can do for free to get going, to get testing, to try these things out, to figure out if it works for you before you start putting in the scale you need for a production application, and then paying as that scale goes up. So lots of free options there. So there's lots of reasons why you should learn Azure. I think it's a great tool, especially for people who are trying things out or developing, because you have the option of just dumping things in the cloud. And then it can be quite easy to replicate a production environment as a dev environment. That's, again, what we do for my company. So when we create a production application in Azure, we create the exact same environment for dev and testing. And yet those are free because of how we set it up. So lots of cool stuff you can do there. There's lots of reasons to use Azure. Let's get into how to learn Azure. What's the order you should learn things in? Now, the very first thing is, of course, the basics. So what do I mean by basics? Well, I mean things like how to configure it, how to log into it, how to get signed up for it, how to take advantage of the free services, the $150 of free credit for the first month, all that kind of stuff. Learn how to set it up, learn how to use resource groups. So resource groups are one of my favorite things about Azure. They're free. It's just basically a tagging system, but it can be so powerful. And it's really powerful for cost management, which is the next thing. So when you're doing cost management, if you put things in a resource group, let's say you're testing something out. You want to try out something huge. Maybe you want to create this massive virtual machine. Well, it's going to cost you, let's say $10, let's say $24 a day. That's $1 an hour. And you set this massive virtual machine up. By the way, that's a big one. But you set up this $1 an hour virtual machine and you try it out. Well, when you create it with a new resource group. You call it whatever you want. Call it trying big VM, whatever. When you are done testing, let's say it takes you half an hour to do a testing. And then you say, okay, I've got the information I need. I've learned what I need to do. I can shut this thing down now and delete it. I'm done my testing. Well, if you delete the resource group, it will delete everything inside. Now, it will ask you and verify, because once you do that, it's all gone. But if you delete the resource group, if it has created other services, let's say that as you set up the virtual machine, it's going to create a drive for you, a storage account, It might create other resources as well. Well, all those resources will also be tagged with that resource group, which means that when you hit the delete on the resource group, it will delete everything associated with what you just did, which means there's no hidden system spinning out there still costing you money. There's no chance that you can have something extra hanging out there that will run up your bill. You don't know why it's there or where it came from or if you can delete it or not. So from a cost management perspective, resource groups are a lifesaver because in this scenario, if it took you half an hour, that will cost you 50 cents. All that testing on that massive machine that costs $24 a day, we're talking now $600 a month, something like that. That expensive machine cost you 50 cents because you did it in half an hour and then you fully deleted everything. So learning how to do effective cost management, learning how to set things up to alert you so that you know, here's my thresholds, here's what I'm expecting to pay. And then you set some thresholds up where you say, hey, let me know when I've burned through 25%, 50%, 75% of my expected burn rate for the month. Because if you say, let's say you set up an email system where it says, hey, alert me at 50%. And you get 14 days into the month and you get an email saying, hey, you've burned through 50% of your expected costs for the month in Azure. You look at that, you look at the date and go, we're right on track. This is what I do. I have an email that comes out to me and says, hey, here's your burn rate. At this point, we hit the threshold and are you expecting that? And I look at it and go, yep, that's perfect. That's right where I expect it to be. And if it's not, let's say you leave a service on, you forget about it. Well, that will come earlier. And you look at that and go, oops, there's a problem here. You go and fix it. And sure, that month will be a little bit more expensive because you had a bad configuration. However, it will be a little extra, not tons extra, because you'll have that trigger hit earlier. So stuff like that, cost management, it's important to learn when you're working with the cloud. Security. And this is another one. If you want to put your applications in the cloud, you need to know how to secure it. Now, with both of these, this is something that people often get, they don't understand about the cloud. They say, well, if it's on my own server, it's free. So cost management, it's too expensive. And for security, again, I have a lock on my door, so therefore my server is secure. Therefore, why do I have to, know how to do this? Well, Azure can be and almost always is more secure than your local server. And yes, that's a big, bold claim, but it's almost always true. Because almost always, your server room is not as secure as the server rooms at Azure. Almost certainly you have more keys or more access to your server room than maybe even you expected. For example, does the janitor ever go in there? Does your vice president ever go in there or have access to it? Do people who might not need to specifically be there ever go there? Okay, that's one option. How many locks does it have? How much security does it have? Does it have biometric access? Does it ensure that it logs every single time anybody goes in or out? And that's just physical security. Then you got to talk about things like your security through all the different configurations on your software, making sure that you're checking all of the security patches on all of your software that's on your servers, not just Windows, all the software that's on your server. Validating, verifying those fixes do what they say they do and do it correctly. And then there's things like the security of the environment, fire, wind, water, flood, all these different things. There's lots of different security to think about in your application. And a lot of times organizations say, well, it hasn't happened. I used to own a server room in a second floor. We never set up anything to monitor for flooding. But yet we had a air conditioning unit in the room to cool the room. Well, what if that air conditioning unit started leaking and it leaked on server? We didn't have any flood monitoring. So if it was on a weekend, we would have had problems. We did have some problems with AC units going down. We didn't have a good monitoring system in place. We improved that because of it. But we put things in place as we learned they could be an issue instead of proactively, because of the fact that it's expensive for what seems like nothing. So that's where a lot of your cloud resources and cloud protects you better than even local. So cost management and security, learning how to set these up and do them well so that you protect your costs. Your costs are now visible instead of invisible. When you say your server is free, no, it's not. You're paying for the electricity. You're paying for the internet. You're paying to maintain it. You're paying for the software on it. You're paying to replace it every 3 to 4 years, and so on. That's hidden cost where it's right up front with this. So anyways, off a soapbox, but cost management and security, they're really important to understand in Azure. Next up, again, this will be focused on if you're a C# developer, a web developer, or in close relationship to any of those. So learning about web apps, static web apps, understanding the difference, understanding how to create a web app really quickly. They're very easy to do and do well, and they are very quick to get up and going. And there's some really cool features in there. For instance, like I mentioned earlier, when you create a web application, you can, if you pay for a slightly higher tier, you can have multiple instances of that web application under that one web app. What that's good for is you set up your development environment, your testing environment, your QA environment, and your production environment. So you can deploy to essentially the same setup, the same configuration as in production, but it's for development. That gives you the best view of how your application is going to perform. It gives you the best look at any bugs that might occur because of how it's configured, or how you, let's say you worked with directly with the operating system, but that doesn't work the same way in Azure as it does on your local machine. Well, you figure that out in development, not once you're pushing to production. You always want to have your development environment mimic your production environment as closely as possible so that you find any issues that might be in production, not just in dev. So that's a great feature, and it's free when you have that larger web app. And by larger, I don't mean very, very expensive. I mean, it could be $10 a month. So that's a really great option. It also allows you to push to production, which does not take your site down. It pushes to a different version. You can test to make sure it's up, and then you can swap it out, which allows you to push to production during a busy day and not have a disruption on your site. Super cool stuff. Lots of stuff you can do there. Lots more power than you can have on your local installation, at least not without a lot of work. So web apps, really cool stuff. Azure SQL, learning about the kind of the standard or the most common database type to use with Microsoft products, which is SQL Server. Azure SQL is there. Again, it's super easy to configure. When it gives you the pricing initially, I think the default pricing is something like $70 a month, which that'd be fine for a production use. I mean, honestly, that's pretty cheap for production for a real database, not just a free database. So people often say, well, I can get a free database. Yes, but your whole business relies on your database. Do you want your database to be cheap, or do you want it to be reliable? And you want it to be reliable. And that's where SQL Server comes in. It's very reliable. It has a lot of features in there for protecting your data, for making sure that your transactions go through correctly, and so many other things. So SQL is a great option. Like I said, by default, I think it's $73 per month. This is US pricing. It depends on the region. But you can change to a development version of SQL that can go down as cheap as $5 per month. for Azure SQL. Now, this is more geared towards development and very small uses, not for heavy usage, heavy transactions, and so on. But that allows you to set up a testing environment. Really cool, though, is when you decide, hey, we're ready to put this into production, we do want to pay for what we need, you can set up what's called an elastic pool, which is we have this pool of resources, and you set up how much resources you have available. And of course, the more resources you have, the more it costs. But you create this pool. And then you can say, I'm going to create my production database using that pool. Cool. And your production database has access to the entire pool. But then you can say, I'm also going to create a development database that has all the same features as the production database, and it will also use the same pool of resources. But you can also cap it and say, yes, it uses the same pool of resources, but don't use more than 25% of the overall pool, which means that you can have, again, a good mirror of your production environment for your development environment, and yet you are safe from the ability to, wreck or ruin your production environment. You've protected yourself that way. But then if you need more resources, you can take them. But then when you don't need the resources, your production site can have more resources. So you can kind of use it both ways. And it just makes better usage of your overall dollars. Really cool stuff you can do there. I found a lot of success in doing that. That pool is amazing. Next up, Azure Functions. Azure Functions are very little, they're called serverless applications. You can create an API off of them. You can create applications that don't have any kind of UI but they trigger. And so you can trigger off of time. You can trigger off of data going to a database or events hitting a message bus or so many other things and do work based upon that. So think of this like a good example might be how Zapier works. So if you've ever seen Zapier where, let's say you buy a course on IamTimCorey.com. One of the things that happens is that my payment system triggers a Zapier message and it says, hey, go ahead and do your thing. And then it takes care of letting Teachable know and doing some other things as well. And so it kind of triggers these events. Well, you can do the same thing with Azure Functions. So Azure Functions are really cheap. In fact, you can use up to 1 million function calls a month for free. That's a lot for testing. So you can set these things up. I would encourage you to use the paid plans for Azure Functions when you're getting into production. But again, when you're doing things in production, you should be paying for them. I know that people love to say, let's do the free stuff for production. But when you're making an income off of something, you should pay for it. And it's not just because, you should pay for what you use. No, the reason why is because when you're paying for it, you get more things for that money. You protect yourself. And one of the things you pay for with Azure Functions is you pay to have your functions already up and running. They're called hot as opposed to cold. So when you use a free function, it can take a little bit of time, up to 30 seconds or more, the first time you call that function for it to do something. And there are ways to keep it live. You can just kind of, ping it with some test stuff over and over again to keep it live. There's other things you can do. But if it's just sitting there waiting, the free one is going to respond a little slowly at first. And then as it gets overloaded, one of the nice things about Azure Functions is that it can scale up. Meaning that if let's say you're doing a registration, and normally registration, let's say for a university, normally registration is, a couple a day here or there, but then the fall hits and every student needs to register. So all of a sudden you go from, 2 or 3 or 4 or 50 to, oh my goodness, we have 50,000. Well, if an Azure function is in that mix somewhere where it has to process all of these, at some point it's going to throw up a flag and say, hey, this is a huge backlog. I need help. The cool thing is it can automatically scale up and create duplicates of itself and scale up another one and another one and another one until it figures out, okay, We're, the 20 of us are handling this and we've knocked that queue down. And now we realize we're starting to run out of work to do. And so we'll scale down the other way and we'll start turning things off. So you only pay for what you use. Well, with these free Azure functions, what happens is you start off cold. So the first one takes a little bit and then it's warm and it's doing its work and it's doing them very quickly. But then it has to scale another one up and it does so once it figures out it needs to, but then that one waits for that scale up of that new one. With the paid version, it's the opposite. You start with the warm ones waiting. And then as it starts to get used, it spins up another one that's waiting. And then as it realizes, ooh, I need more help. And so it's going to use a second one. But then when it does that, it spools up a third one. So you're always one ahead. So you're always quicker on the uptick. So usually the paid version works out better for Azure functions unless you don't mind that initial lag time. And especially in dev, you shouldn't need to mind the initial lag time, which means it's free for 1 million calls a month. So that's the next thing to learn. And then also Cosmos DB. This is Microsoft's document database. There's a lot of different ways you can interact with it. It has you can use the Mongo commands, you can use the SQL commands, you can use a number of other commands and treat it differently depending on what kind of documents you need. It's a really cool service. There is a free version of it, and it scales up worldwide very quickly and very easily. So you can have read-only or read and write copies across the globe in different data centers so that you can have your database as close as possible to your customers. Really cool stuff. It makes your business very effective globally and allows you to do a lot of cool things. So if you need a NoSQL database, Cosmos DB is a good option. So learning that is important. So this is the learning path so far. These are the big hitters. But hang on to your seats. We've got more that I'm going to cover briefly, and you should at least know they exist and then figure out which ones are needed for your case and then keep expanding. Add more services, understand more services and how they work in order to really get a good picture of all of what's available. So next up, Key Vault. Azure Key Vault is amazing. It's the place where you can store all of your secret stuff. And you can do things like rotate keys, and you can have all your services point to the Key Vault to get that key. Therefore, when you do need to change the value of the key, you change it in one spot. It can version that, so you can roll back to a previous version. There's lots of stuff you can do there with Key Vault. It's super secure. It's a great option for all of your secret needs, things like connection strings and database passwords and so many other things that your applications need, but you don't want to put in a source control. You don't want maybe even anybody to have access to. So your developers can work with the Dev SQL Server without ever having the Dev SQL Server password. They can not have access at all to the production server, but yet their code, when they push it, can go into production and have access to the production server. So really cool stuff. They can change based off environments. Awesome stuff with Key Vault. Azure Storage. This is just, it's simple and it's easy and it's really powerful. It can be a little confusing at first. Again, the way cloud does things can be obtuse at times, but once you learn how storage works, it's basically a place to dump files, and yet it's also a way to version files. It's also a way to easily have access to those files from other locations or the web. This is what I use for my code emailing system. So when you watch a normal YouTube video on Monday on this channel, what you'll see is, I might show off, a C# application. I might say, hey, here's this, you can see how to use tuples in C#. And I'll do a little demo and say, hey, if you want the source code, just use a link down below. It will email you the source code. Well, part of that is an Azure function that says, we want to send this file, which is in storage. And I look that up in Azure SQL. We say, hey, I want to send this file to this person. Here's the link for it. Download it and put it in an email and send it to them. Now I'm making, just so you know, this is a side note, I am making some tweaks to that because right now I attach the actual file. But a lot of ISPs hate zip file source code. So we're going to be sending a link to that storage location, but I don't want to send a link directly to the storage location because then if I make some changes or people might link directly to it, and that would be problematic for other reasons. So I am working on a system for that. That will come out soon, but this is what I use that tool for, and it's practically free. So it's a 3 little tools hooked together, and all of a sudden, boom, there we go. Use an Azure web app for the front end website. So Azure storage, really cool stuff. Hey, there's storage again. There we go. Sorry about that. It's Cache for Redis. So the Cache for Redis is the Azure Cache for Redis is a way to really quickly get an Azure or Redis cache up and running. Redis cache allows you to cache your database, so you don't have to go back to the SQL database or wherever you store your data for every call. It makes it much, much quicker for your web pages to interact with things. So let's say that one of the things I use this for is in my my suggestion app. So you go to suggestions.imtimcorey.com. We have a caching system. And what that means is there's right now 400 plus suggestions on the suggestion site. By the way, if you want a suggestion for a future video topic to be covered, go to the suggestion site. So suggestions.imtimcorey.com. But we have over 400 suggestions right now on the site. Well, they don't update very often. But yet, every time you go to the page, it's going to display those 400 suggestions. So instead of going to the database for that, I cache that information. And you can cache that using Redis. That's one of the options. There's other options in Azure, of course, but that's a really great option for really speeding up your site. It reduces the cost on your database, it speeds up your site, and makes it a better experience for your customers. Next up, Azure Service Bus. So Service Bus is a great tool, especially for microservices. So Service Bus, think of it like an emailing system where one service says, hey, this is what I did, and it drops the email in. And then anybody that needs that email, anybody that needs that information reads it and goes, okay, I can do something with this now. And it's a disconnected way for various services to talk to each other without knowing about each other. Because the first service has no clue what's going to happen next. It just knows I did my part and I've told people. I've told the service bus. Now the next service goes, I'm waiting for someone to do this. It has no clue who does it or how it's done. It just knows I wait for this. And when it happens on the service bus, it gets triggered and it does its next job. So service bus, really important, again, especially for microservices. AKS, which is Azure's Kubernetes service. So Kubernetes, if you're not familiar, is a monster of a system. It's designed to use containers to do whole systems. Again, microservices is a really big user of AKS or Kubernetes in general. AKS is an easier implementation of direct Kubernetes, meaning you don't have to deal with some of the underlying structural setup. It makes life easier. It adds some general protections for you and some ease of use and ease of work in AKS. So AKS, it's a big system, but AKS makes it easier so that if you're using Kubernetes, which is an even larger system, you can really protect yourself and make better options and decisions with less resources. Search. Search is a tool that allows you to do Google-like searching where you can dive into your data and really figure out how to do fuzzy searches and so many other things. There's lots of stuff you can do with Azure Search. Virtual machines. I left this near the end because the first thing people think of when they think of the cloud is, oh, I can create a virtual machine in the cloud. And absolutely you can. And there is a benefit to doing so. However, it's not for every situation. In fact, it's not for most situations. I recommend against starting with virtual machines, which is why it's near the end of my learning path. Because a virtual machine means you have to maintain the operating system. You have to maintain the patching and the security and the applications that are installed and so many other things. Whereas these other things, the real benefit is that Microsoft has a team of engineers that handles all the security for you. And you just say, these are the 3 features I want, and that's it. With a virtual machine, the only thing they're providing is the physical security. All the rest of the stuff pretty much is on you. You have to install the operating system. You have to configure it. You have to patch it, and so on. There are uses for this. One of the uses that I used it for at one job was with Azure DevOps. They give you a certain number of free build minutes per month. And so we were using Azure DevOps for all of our CI/CD process, and we were way exceeding the number of free build minutes. Well, you can install an Azure DevOps build system. It's a little install on pretty much anything. You can install on your own machine and then use that machine instead of Azure's free machine. And then you can use as many minutes as you want because it's your machine. Well, I didn't want it to be on my machine because that creates a dependency I don't want. I don't want to have it always connected and so on. So I created a virtual machine in Azure and then installed the build server stuff on it. So Azure DevOps pointed to an Azure virtual machine and was happy as a clam to build as much as he wanted to, as fast as he wanted to. So that's an option as well. Finally, this is kind of all-encompassing. So I'm not necessarily saying learn App Insights last, but it's going to encompass a lot of these things, and it's going to help you figure out what's going on with your various systems, especially once you start using Azure in more depth. As using, instead of one service or one web app or one database, you're using multiple web apps and multiple functions and service bus and caching and storage and all the rest. The application insights will give you great insights as to what's going wrong, where it's going wrong, how the interactivity is working, what you can do to diagnose and fix it. So application insights is another tool you should learn. So that's kind of my learning order for Azure. There's a lot of stuff here. And quite frankly, this is just scratching the surface of all of Azure. However, as a developer, this is an excellent place to start. If you were to even just do the first 3 layers, you will have a lot of information on your belt. You will be well prepared to use the cloud. And then if you pick a few more things that are most relevant to you out of that next row, App Insights almost certainly. But maybe Service Bus is the next thing you need to learn, or caching or storage or Key Vault is a great one. But if you start picking those things out and saying, okay, well, I'll learn this one next, and you start adding a few of those even, you will be in the top tier of Azure developers. You will definitely set yourself apart as a C# developer or web developer, and you'll be much more valuable to your company. So that's the learning path. Let's talk learning steps. So each step, what do? Well, learn a single feature. Don't bounce from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. Pick one thing. If you're going to do, let's say, Azure SQL, well, learn that single feature. Focus on just that. Then identify the pricing options. This is one of those important things you need to understand and do. Look at the pricing page. If you Google Azure Pricing Calculator, it's a great tool that will show you exactly what the pricing is going to be for your application. Now, there are some things that seem a little bit nebulous because of the fact that it depends on how much you use it. So if you don't know how much you're going to use things, then yeah, that can be a little confusing at times, but that's where you need to kind of understand your usage. So you need to have some understanding of how much you use things. And if you don't know, then start off small and figure that out. But understand the pricing options. Then build a test instance. Don't build a test instance until you understand the pricing options. Because if you just say, well, I'll just, pick whatever configuration I want, well, there's different pricing implications for whichever one you choose. So understand the pricing first so that you know which things to pick in order to stay in your budget. But build a test instance. This should be probably the cheapest instance possible because you're doing testing. and then use the test instance for an extended time. Don't just create it and go, cool, it's there, and then shut it off. If you're, again, using Azure SQL, well, then put a little bit of data in a database and start using it with a development app. And don't just use it for an hour, use it for a couple of days. See how it responds when you don't use it for 6 hours and come back and start using it again. See any lag time or slowdown issues or whatever. Figure it out, and then monitor the cost and performance. Again, if you're using the cheapest thing, it will be the slowest, but monitor that performance, see how it works, and see, oh, you know what? I think even for starting off, we should probably bump up to the next tier. And you can do that. You can change the pricing tier of most things just by going in and saying, give me more features, give me more power. So, and it will tell you, this is what's going to cost, but you can do that. But also monitor those costs. Make sure that your understanding of how the costs work is actually accurate. So monitor those so you really understand this feature. You don't understand a feature until you understand how the cost works, how to configure it, how to use it, what the quirks are, and how you could best use this in your environment. But once you know all of that, repeat. So do all this for a single feature. Take all these steps one by one. Don't repeat until after you've gone through all 5 steps. All right, let's talk the easy path. If you've been watching these videos before, you've seen all the different easy paths that I have depending on what we're learning or what we're talking about in that video. Well, in this video, we're talking about Azure, and you're going to love this easy path. That's it. That's the whole path. Azure from start to finish, the course, it's $97. It will vary depending on if VAT is applied or not, or other taxes. But Azure from start to finish covers all of this. It covers every bit of it. Now, the top tier of the learning path, it does not go into depth on. It does not go into a deep dive on how to use it and configure it and all the rest. It gives you more an overview of that and how to get started and how to set it up. But it covers everything that we talked about. Azure from start to finish is the place to go. That's why I designed it this way, because I knew, hey, this is a big deal. You need to be confident in the cloud. You need to be confident that you're not going to blow through tons of money, that you're secure, that you can work with a team on this, that you can protect who has access to what, that you can add new features without wondering, did I shut off the old ones, or am I spending more money than I should? All those things. So the entire path is just one course. And then let's talk tips and tricks. Okay. First one, this is the hard-coded, always important, never skip step, which is practice isn't extra. It's essential. You need to practice. You can't just say, hey, I watched a video on how to do Azure databases. I got this. Super simple. It's just like SQL. I understand it. 3 different options in the setup and we're done. Nope. You need to practice. Otherwise, you'll get burned. I've seen it happen way too many times not to make this a hard-coded, always-on tip. Number 2, compare apples to apples. We've touched on this before, but when you are comparing a price of something, you need to compare apples to apples. This is where I see way too many companies making bad decisions because they have an apples to oranges comparison on the cloud options. We've talked a lot about your local server, but let's just talk a little bit more about it. A local server might cost you $3,000 to purchase a semi-decent server. Okay, it's probably more than that. It's probably more like $6,000 to $8,000, but let's just say $3,000, and you're going to use it for 3 years. Well, that's $1,000 a year. That's $3 a day, and that's just for the hardware. Now let's talk about how much it's going to cost you in electricity and in UPS batteries, which you have to replace, don't forget. And you should probably test as well. And then we're talking about bandwidth. How much is that bandwidth going to cost you? And how much is the cooling in your room going to cost for that extra server and all the extra heat it puts out? And the list goes on. This is where an apples to apples comparison really has to be, is if you need a SQL server and you're paying $3,000 for the hardware every 3 years, and you're paying, even $1,000 for SQL licensing, which good luck getting it that cheap, but $1,000 for a SQL licensing, that's $4,000 every 3 years. And then you add in the other costs, you're probably at $6,000 to $10,000. Let's say $9,000 for the 3 years, $3,000 a year, which now we're talking about, what is that, $8 a day? So can you get resources in the cloud for a SQL server for under $8 a day? Absolutely. And you know what? That's when you can have an apples to apples comparison and say, you know what? We need all the power possible in this server that we have, and a comparable version in the cloud would cost us $10 a day. So therefore, the $8 a day that on-prem, the local server, makes more sense. Now you still should think about redundancy and testing backups and security and all the rest. But let's just say that you did, and it came out to be cheaper locally. Cool. That's an apples to apples comparison. But when you say, well, we already have the server and we already have the internet, we already have, power going to that room, we already have a UPS we plugged it into, so therefore it's free. Well, no, it's not. That's an apples to oranges comparison. So compare apples to apples. Really look at your actual costs, because you can go bankrupt using free stuff because of the fact that it's not really free. So be careful when you're comparing to compare apples to apples. And be realistic, because you know what? There are times when local will be cheaper, and cheaper even when you compare all the stuff you need to do. And that's okay. Also, there are times when you might say, we're okay with the risk, because doing it locally is more risky than doing it in the cloud. Because when you do it locally, yes, you control your servers, but one person with a pair of lock picks in the middle of the night can get access to your server room and pull all your hard drives. Is it going to happen? Probably not, but it might. Well, that's a risk. But if you say, you know what, we don't think it's going to happen, therefore we're okay with that risk, then you're saying, okay, I can pay less and have it locally because I'm okay with the additional risk. So just be very clear on your evaluation to compare apples to apples. Number 3, set up pricing alerts. I cannot emphasize this enough. Don't just figure out the problem after you get a bill that hits your credit card. It's too late. It's too late at that point. Yes, you can talk to your representative, and yes, they might have mercy on you and they might give you some credit, but don't wait for that. Instead, set up pricing alerts. There's speed bumps. Let it hit the speed bumps. Let it make sure that you're on track every week. And you can do that automatically. You don't have to be manually checking your pricing. You can have it automatically happen, and you can just verify, yes, we're on track. Yes, we're on track. Oops, we're not on track. What happened? So let the tools work for you. Set up pricing alerts. Number 4, document the steps you take and the options you choose. This is a rookie mistake that people often do more than once before they figure it out. When you're setting up a server and you're trying things out and say, okay, I want to see if this, the SQL server, I'm using that as an example. I want to see if this SQL server is going to work out the way I want it to. You set it all up and it works and it's great. And so you say, cool, this development system works great. I'm going to shut it down because I don't want to pay for it. But now we're going to set it up for production use. And then you set it up for production use and things don't work the same way because you forgot you made a tweak to the configuration in your development environment. You don't know which one it was, and you've already deleted it, so you can go back and check. Document the steps you take. If there's only a few pages of options, usually, maybe you're choosing 5 or 10 options for any configuration, except for the most complex ones. But 5 or 10 options, document them. Say, okay, these are the things I did for this setup, and this is the size I chose, and so on, so that you know what options you chose, so that it's much easier to replicate later. You can also figure out the actual command it runs in the Azure command line and keep a copy of that. That way you can even automate the creation of that system again. So document the steps you took. Number 5, push to learn every feature and option, not just enough to get it working. This is super helpful when you run into a problem because you already know the features and options. It makes it so much simpler to get past a production issue. I remember being in a meeting once where I was in a meeting, my boss was talking, and I got an alert that our website was acting slow. Not down, just slow. And I looked, and sure enough, we had maxed out our elastic pool for our database, which is, again, that pool of resources. We maxed out the usage of it, so we were kind of throttled with how much our database could do. And so we were starting to build up a queue, and things were taking, half a second instead of a millisecond. Or people were waiting a little bit after they clicked something. And so while I was in the meeting, my boss was talking, I went into the portal, I knew which option I needed, I made a change, I hit apply, and I saw the results. I saw our website go back to normal before my boss was done talking. And so when it became my turn, I said, hey, just so you know, 5 minutes ago, we had a problem, and I resolved it. So knowing every featured option makes it super comfortable for you to go, oh, that's the problem. I can scale it this way and do that. Or, oh, that's the problem. I can change this setting here and track all the issues and at least have more diagnostic information. Or whatever the case may be, understand the features and options. Don't just do enough to get it working. Otherwise, it's a fragile black box. You don't want to have a fragile black box, especially not in production. When you rely on something, you should know how it works fully. And so learn every feature and option. That's why, again, when it comes to the steps for learning an individual thing, practice everything about it. Don't just practice the bare minimum to get it working. All right, so that's my tips and tricks for learning Azure. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Hopefully you got a lot of value out of it. I know I spent a lot of time giving you, my decades of wisdom here, but hopefully that will help you out in the future, and hopefully it will have a better experience with the cloud, with Azure specifically. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.